It was a quiet, unassuming Wednesday evening when I decided to stop by the small neighborhood restaurant I had frequented over the past few years. The kind of place that felt familiar from the moment you walked through the doors because of the soft yellow lighting, the smell of grilled food lingering in the air, and the framed photographs of local sports teams and community events lining the walls. And although I expected nothing more than a simple meal and a brief respite from the hectic pace of my workday, I had no idea that the few minutes I would spend reading the menu before ordering would escalate into one of the most absurd and humiliating encounters of my life, involving a stranger's unreasonable anger, a 911 call, and the eventual arrival of a police officer in the middle of the dining area, all over something as mundane as taking time to decide what to eat. When I first walked into the restaurant, I noticed that the atmosphere was unusually calm for a weekday evening, with only a few families scattered across the tables, and the gentle hum of conversation blending with the soft background music that filled the room. And after a hostess greeted me and asked if I was dining alone, I confirmed that I was and allowed her to lead me to a small table near the window, where I could watch the parking lot outside while I settled in and mentally prepared to enjoy a quiet meal. Because sometimes the simple act of sitting down in a familiar place and taking a moment for yourself can feel like a rare luxury after a day filled with work, errands, and responsibilities. She handed me a laminated menu and smiled politely before returning to the host's stand, and I immediately began scanning the pages, noting that the restaurant had recently added several new dishes that sounded appealing, including a grilled chicken sandwich with a unique herb sauce, a pasta entree with fresh vegetables and house-made sauce, and a few seasonal specials that seemed both inventive and comforting. And because I wanted to make an informed decision rather than hastily choosing the first item that caught my eye, I allowed myself the time to read through the entire menu carefully, occasionally glancing up to observe the surroundings and appreciate the low-key charm of the place. After a few minutes of concentration, I became vaguely aware that someone at the table behind me had started staring in my direction. And while I initially dismissed it as mere coincidence or curiosity, I gradually realized that her gaze was deliberate, sharp, and unmistakably critical. And when I occasionally glanced over my shoulder, I saw a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, dressed in casual clothing, leaning slightly forward in her chair with arms crossed and an expression that combined irritation with self-righteous judgment, as if she had already concluded that my mere presence and activity were personally offensive to her. I tried to ignore her, assuming that she might simply be impatient or in a bad mood, and focused on the menu, comparing the different options in detail, because I was genuinely torn between two dishes, each sounding delicious and each offering slightly different flavors and textures. And after several minutes, I thought I had narrowed it down when I felt a sigh from behind me, audible enough to make me pause mid-sentence in my mental deliberation. A long, dramatic exhalation clearly meant to convey her frustration with what she must have perceived as an excessive amount of time spent reading the menu, though in reality it was hardly unusual by any reasonable standard. I returned my attention to the menu, but the woman spoke again, this time loud enough that several nearby diners looked over in confusion, as if they were witnessing the beginning of an argument. And she said, "Some people really shouldn't come to restaurants if they can't make a decision," in a tone dripping with condescension and moral judgment. And for a moment I considered responding with a polite remark, but instead I simply nodded slightly and returned to my own table, thinking that ignoring her would prevent unnecessary conflict. Yet within moments, it became clear that she had no intention of leaving it at that. She leaned forward slightly and said again, louder this time, "Is there a problem?" And when I turned around to face her, expecting perhaps a sarcastic smirk or an apology, I was met with a glare that left no doubt she was serious, and before I could answer, she continued, "Yes, actually, there's a problem. You're holding up the entire restaurant." At first, I was speechless because the statement was so patently absurd, given that the restaurant was far from full, with several empty tables visible across the room and no staff appearing to be in any rush. But I remained calm and explained that I was simply taking a moment to read the menu thoroughly, and that the server had explicitly told me to take my time because there was no hurry, assuming that such a rational explanation would suffice to de-escalate the situation. Yet the woman was already beyond reason. She shook her head dramatically and muttered under her breath, though loud enough for others to hear, "People like you slow everything down." And then, without any warning, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and spoke in a voice that left no room for doubt, saying clearly, "Yes, I'd like to report someone causing a disturbance at a restaurant." And it was at that moment that I realized the confrontation had escalated beyond mere irritation or sarcasm, because she was genuinely calling emergency services to report a man for taking a little extra time to read a menu, something so trivial and ridiculous that it bordered on surreal. The nearby diners began to exchange looks of disbelief, some trying to suppress laughter while others stared in shock, and the server paused at a nearby table, clearly uncertain how to respond, while the woman continued to explain to the dispatcher that a man was refusing to order and disrupting the restaurant, describing me in the most exaggerated way possible while gesturing toward my table as if I were committing some egregious crime, and the absurdity of the situation left me sitting there stunned, clutching the menu and trying to maintain composure, as I realized that this ordinary dinner stop was now rapidly transforming into a public spectacle. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the restaurant manager approached, calmly asking the woman if there was a problem and explaining politely that customers are always allowed to take the time they need to decide what to order, particularly when the kitchen is running normally and other patrons are not being impeded. But she waved him off and continued insisting that the police needed to intervene immediately, clearly convinced that her judgment of the situation was the only one that mattered. About 10 minutes later, a uniformed police officer arrived, walking into the restaurant and pausing near the entrance to assess the situation. And the woman immediately pointed at me with dramatic certainty, saying loudly, "That's him. He's been refusing to order and holding up the restaurant," as if she had caught a criminal red-handed, and the officer turned to me, then to the menu in my hands, and finally to the manager, his expression suggesting that he could not quite believe the story he was hearing but needed to investigate nonetheless. "Sir," the officer said politely, "what seems to be the problem here?" I explained calmly that I was simply reading the menu and deciding between two meals, noting that the server had told me to take my time and that there was no rush, and the manager confirmed my account, explaining that I had only been seated for a short while and that I had done nothing wrong, while the woman continued to insist, raising her voice slightly, that this was a serious disturbance and that police intervention was necessary. The officer listened patiently, glanced at the menu and the nearly empty restaurant, and then turned back to the woman with a calm but firm tone, stating clearly that reading a menu in a restaurant is not illegal and that emergency services are intended for real emergencies rather than disputes over how long someone takes to choose a meal. And as he spoke, I could see the realization slowly dawning on her face that perhaps she had overreacted, though her embarrassment was masked by lingering indignation. Finally, I placed my order with the server, a slight smile tugging at the corners of my lips despite the awkwardness, and the officer gave me a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the woman, gently reminding her that the police should not be called for trivial disagreements in public spaces and that she could voice concerns to management instead if she noticed a genuine issue in the future, while other diners returned to their meals and the soft background music resumed, restoring the calm atmosphere that had existed before the encounter. As I sat down to wait for my meal, still slightly shaken but relieved that the situation had been resolved without further escalation, I reflected on the absurdity of what had just occurred. What should have been a simple, forgettable evening meal had instead become an unexpected lesson in entitlement, patience, and the bizarre extremes to which some people are willing to take their perceived grievances. And although I had spent less than 20 minutes reading a menu, the experience left an indelible impression, a story that I knew I would recount for years with disbelief that a 911 call could ever be made, simply because someone was taking their time to decide what to eat in a restaurant. By the time my food arrived, I had regained some of my composure, but I couldn't stop thinking about how easily ordinary situations can spiral out of control when someone is determined to manufacture conflict. And as I finally took the first bite of my meal, I realized that despite the ridiculousness of the encounter, I had emerged unscathed and could laugh quietly at the sheer absurdity of it, knowing that I had maintained my patience and dignity while the entitled, overreacting woman had inadvertently turned herself into the subject of quiet amusement for everyone around her, leaving me with a memorable story that was equal parts frustrating and surreal, proving that sometimes the most ridiculous confrontations stem from the most mundane actions, like taking a few extra minutes to read a menu before ordering dinner.